Over the last decade, bare knuckle boxing has emerged from the shadows and is now the fastest growing combat sport worldwide. But many people think there's a stigma about bare knuckle boxing, and very often you do hear people objecting and belittling to it, and very often on the grounds of safety. But what about the actual story, the true story of the safety of the sport of bare knuckle boxing? This is something very often undermined, generally from those who know absolutely nothing about it. Very often people involved with the British Board of Boxing control. But if you look at any academic or medical study that's ever been published, you may well be shocked. In fact, you may be very shocked to find out that bare knuckle boxing is actually safer, medically proven to be safer than glove boxing. We've all met an old boxer whose speech is slurred and has memory problems, and I suppose it's easy to scoff and just call them punch drunk. But this is actually a very serious, very permanent condition called pugilistic dementia, or CTE. And put simply, this is caused by blows to the head, resulting in the brain moving inside the skull. This is a very serious neurological condition, and oddly enough, is also seen in alcoholics, caused by repeated cerebral concussions and characterised by a weakness in the lower limbs, unsteadiness, slowness of muscular movement, hand tremors, hesitancy of speech, loss of memory, mental dullness. This affects on average around 20% of professional boxers, and very often they can also be the cause of the debilitating Parkinson's disease, which can be seen perhaps with one of the greatest of all time, Muhammad Ali. As you can see from the illustration, there is a huge difference just to look at a normal brain as opposed to brains damaged with CTE. So the question is, what can you do to make the sport of boxing safer? Pretty easy, get rid of the gloves. As you will know, the current rules of boxing started from the Marquis of Queensberry rules from 1867. These are a set of rules from more than a century ago, and they categorically state that a boxer must wear gloves. But what is the reason for this? Okay, yes, on first hearing this, due to the fact that a boxing glove is basically a glorified pad that covers the fist, I can forgive you for thinking, well, of course, it's for safety. But I can tell you, you're wrong. As crazy it may seem, you're wrong. Let me explain to you why, and let me present the facts which I guarantee will change your views, not only on the safety of bare knuckle boxing, but also glove boxing. Gloves were introduced to make competitions bloodier. Gloves distribute a blow, and they add weight to a punch, making it far more destructive. The Marquis of Queensberry rules took off not only because society viewed the new sport as more civilised to the old, but because fights conducted under the new guidelines attracted more spectators. And the reason for this? The audience wanted to see the repeated blows to the head and dramatic knockouts. And this is just what they got after the introduction of gloves. Since gloves spread the impact of a blow and increased the volume, the recipient of a punch is less likely to have their teeth knocked out or their jaw broken or to cut, but is far more likely to be knocked out. The reason for this, again, contrary to what a lot of people think, gloves do not lessen the force that's applied. It actually increases force that is applied, and it rattles the brain inside the skull every time they receive a heavy blow. They do make matters worse by adding at least 10 ounces to the weight of the fist and spreading the blow over a larger area. So in essence, a blow to the head with gloves is distributing a harder, more powerful force across a larger area of the skull, which creates increased velocity or force to the brain and actually rattles it inside the cerebral fluid inside the skull. Full force of a punch to the head is comparable with being hit by a 12-pound padded wooden mallet travelling at 20 miles an hour. And I don't care who you are, you know that a blow of such magnitude will not do your brain any good at all. As the bare knuckle campaigner Dr. Alan J. Ryan pointed out, in 100 years of bare knuckle fighting in the United States, which terminated around 1897, there wasn't a single ring fatality. Today, there are 3 or 4 every year in the US, and around 15% of professional fighters suffer from some form of permanent brain damage during their career. And everyone knows all forms of boxing, be it gloved or bare knuckle, can be dangerous, and nobody's denying this. After all, boxing is a combat sport, but has boxing always been this dangerous? Arguably, the answer is no. Ancient boxing was indeed far more brutal, with fighters wearing crude coverings on their hands, sometimes with spikes embedded on them, and this was to protect the hand and maximise damage, head and the body of the fighter. It wasn't until the 18th century in England, with the introduction of bare knuckle fighting or prize fighting, that the safety of boxing from a fighter's point of view was really addressed. The London Prize Ring Rules 1743 were introduced by bare knuckle heavyweight champion Jack Broughton and gave the fighter two clear safety advantages over their ancient and also their modern counterparts. Firstly, each fighter was allowed at any time during the fight to drop to one knee for 30 seconds. During this time, the other fighter was not allowed to attack or strike the resting fighter. They were only allowed to regain their composure and then continue if they could. Today, the referee is the only person that can stop a bout, and only then if he feels the fight is unfairly matched or one fighter is unable to continue due to injury or cuts, or if one fighter cannot defend himself. As we've seen, this can be often the result of fighters taking too much punishment before the referee stops. The corner can throw in the towel, but that is still the referee's decision whether to accept that and to end the fight or not. We have seen this can very often be the result of fighters taking too much punishment before the referee steps in, and by then, unbeknown to anyone, the damage can already be done. Secondly, and more significantly, the fighters wore no gloves, which meant they were far more cautious when going for headshots due to the damage that it did to their hands. Today's modern game is more uncommon with its ancient ancestors in regard to gloves, now facilitate multiple headshots, and the scoring system used also favours headshots.
Talking about the brain, you should know that when you shake it, you break it.
Looking at these facts, it's hard to justify the setup of modern boxing when you talk about the safety of the fighters. Would a return to bare knuckle boxing see a reduction in injuries or a reduction in ticket sales and pay-per-view revenue? This is possibly where the real issue lies in the modern game, and not with the safety of the sport. When a young amateur or journeyman pro is killed in the ring, there's around half a dozen on average every year worldwide. Often, there's not all that much fuss, which is sad. The sports rule-making bodies come under intense public pressure to make the self-styled noble art of self-defense less lethal. It happened, for instance, when Benny Paret, a Cuban welterweight, died in 1962 after being battered in a televised fight in New York. It happened again in 1980 when Johnny Owen, a Welsh bantamweight, died in Los Angeles after fighting for a version of a world championship. And it happened once more when America's Gerald McLean lay critically ill in a London hospital where he had a blood clot removed from his brain after being knocked out by Britain's Nigel Benn on a live televised fight for a slice of the middleweight title. Although boxing is cursed with an alphabet soup of competing regulatory bodies, most of the changes have been broadly accepted in an effort to appease the sports critics. The duration of world title fights has now been cut from 15 to 12 rounds. You will see later in this presentation the reason why. There are mandatory suspensions for boxers who suffered knockouts or technical knockouts. Boxers are subjected to comprehensive medical examinations and tested for narcotics. Referees are very much more now willing to stop fights to outclass contestants from the further punishment like they used to get in the bad old days of Homicide Hamp Armstrong, Gorilla Jones and the Astoria Assassin. But one change seen by some as making the sport more safe has made it more dangerous. Ever plumper boxing glove, heavier gloves as bustier mitts were first worn in World Championship fights in 1892. Since then, the regulations of gloves have got heavier and heavier until today's middleweights and above now only wear 10 ounce, 283 gram gloves, but they're also permitted to have each hand wrapped in up to 18 feet which is 5.5 metres of bandages held in place by 9 to 11 feet of zinc oxide tape. This pattern helps the hitter and hurts the hittee. Since the bones in a man's head are stronger than the bones in a man's fist, a bare-knuckle fighter risks damage to himself more than his opponent if he hits as hard as he can with full force and aims that punch at the head. Unless he has unusually brittle hands, a boxer whose fists are protected by cushions has no such inhibitions. He can hit to the head full force without so much risk of injuring his hands, and so to add to the number of boxers who will end up on the slab or with pugilistic dementia. This can be compared with the illustration shown here, and show that the secondary impact of the brain hitting the inside of the skull is what causes the brain trauma. The bigger projectile, the bigger the primary impact, and the bigger and more severe the secondary impact. When one relates the projectile as a fist, either gloved or ungloved, it makes it very easy to say that an ungloved fist or projectile is smaller in size than that of the gloved fist or projectile. Prize fighting in the 19th century under the old Broughton rules was far more brutal than today's professional boxing. Nobody sensible wants to return to the days where pugilists fought to finish brawls that sometimes lasted for hours and nearly 100 rounds. But a return to bare knuckles would make the sport far safer than it is now with gloves. To summarise, Nicholas Hobbs, a sports historian, states that gloves were introduced for two main reasons: to lengthen bouts, and because the audience wanted to see repeated blows to the head and dramatic knockouts. He also stated that bare knuckle boxing, or boxing without gloves, or without any type of padded hand protection, the reason bare knuckle boxers took a stance that looks so silly to us now is that they were mainly protecting their bodies. The head was not the primary target, since a worthwhile punch to the head would probably break the puncher's hand. Not so once the gloves were introduced. Gloves distribute the force of a punch more widely, reducing the instances of broken jaws, knocked out teeth, blindness, and they also add 10 ounces of weight to each swing, making a full-on punch comparable with being hit by a 12-pound padded wooden mallet travelling at 20 miles per hour. With gloves, the pain of clobbering a skull is significantly reduced. The head is now the primary target. Before, boxing may have looked messier and perhaps more voyeuristically violent, but with gloves now, it can be deadly. So accordingly, bare knuckle boxing may look more violent, and it may prevent fighters from always being able to fully throw weight behind a punch, and at times prevents fighters from targeting each other's heads. And glove boxing encourages more headshots, and yes, maybe it appears to be less violent, but it can cause extensive brain damage, and in general, each blow always felt more powerfully and spread out more than before. So I ask you, in all honesty, does bare knuckle boxing deserve the stigma that it seems to have? My opinion is no. Whilst it may sound as if I'm seeming to suggest that I'm against glove boxing personally, that definitely isn't the case. I merely wish to highlight the fact that bare knuckle boxing, which is very often stigmatised and seen as inherently dangerous, is by far safer than the mainstream sport of boxing.